Earlier this year I was at a flea market when I saw a Canon Canonet Rangefinder camera sitting in a box of old photography stuff. I was intrigued by the design with the advancing lever on the bottom of the camera, but it was filthy and covered in grime, the lens was loose and wobbling around, the shutter wouldn't fire, the aperture blades were stuck, and as is normal the light seals had perished into a sticky mess. I walked away without even asking the price, but periodically I would think about that camera and how nice it would be to bring it back to life. Obviously I could have bought one on eBay, but I resisted that temptation. Anyway, about 3 months later I saw the same stall, and there was the Canonet sitting in the same box, still just as dirty and unloved. Obviously I bought it, and then the restoration began. I gradually took the camera apart, cleaning things up as I went along. With the top and bottom covers off and the leatherette trim removed, the entire shutter and lens assembly can be removed, complete with the front plate. Then it was off with the front lens elements and control rings to get to the shutter assembly itself. The self-timer is this module, and the shutter timer is over here. This camera has a good range of speeds, from 1 second to 1/500th of a second, plus the obligatory bulb setting. But there was still more to do. Both the shutter blades and the aperture blades were stuck, so the shutter needed to be split in half to access those. Here are the aperture blades, after cleaning and repositioning in the housing, and here are the shutter blades, again after cleaning. The blades on this shutter have an additional plate at the driven end. 4 of those sit beneath the blade, with the last one sitting on top. Luckily I was able to get a manual for this shutter, because I'd have probably assumed this was wrong if I'd not seen it described in the manual. Reassembling the two halves is really fiddly, and it took a couple of attempts to get it together without the shutter blades moving off their posts. After that it was just a case of cleaning, re-lubricating and adjusting the rest of the camera before reassembling it and checking that everything was working as it should be. The wobbly lens was due to the lock ring that secures the shutter and lens unit to the focusing helicoid working itself loose, which has also happened on this second copy that I've got. In fact, this one shares all of the same problems, but additionally the focus ring isn't attached to the helicoid and the meter doesn't work. Hopefully that's just that the wire has been torn off from the Selenium cell. Someone has clearly had a go at this one because the leatherette has been peeled off and the Selenium cell has been rotated from its original position. But that's all something to look at on another day. For now I'll talk a little bit about the history before we take a look at some of the shots taken on the camera. The Canonet was first introduced around 1961 with a 45mm f1.9 lens surrounded by a Selenium cell, as on my camera. The first version doesn't give you any indication of the aperture it's selecting when in auto mode, you just get an over or underexposure warning arrow. They changed this on the later copies, as is the case with my as yet unrepaired copy, which does now show the aperture in the viewfinder. According to information I've read online, Canon sold 1 million Canonets in the first 2.5 years, so there are still likely to be plenty around. By 1964 the Selenium cell had been replaced by a CDS cell, and the film advancing lever had moved to a more conventional spot on top of the camera. They'd also upgraded the lens to an f1.7 version, although with the introduction of the QL or quick loading model in 1965, they offered cheaper versions with f1.9 and f2.5 lenses. Canon carried on producing various models of the Canonet right up to the early 80s with the third generation QL cameras. Okay, time for a quick break to look at some of the shots taken on this camera before I go over the camera controls. Most of the controls for the Canonet are located on and around the lens barrel, which is the same on many other rangefinder cameras of this type. The film speed is set using this lever on the bottom, with a window displaying the DIN numbers on the underside, and another window showing the ASA numbers on top. ASA being the same as the more familiar ISO speeds used nowadays. There are these three symbols next to the shutter speed lever which took me a while to figure out. But if you're using the camera's shutter priority auto exposure mode, having set the correct film speed first, you then rotate the shutter speed ring until the lever sits next to sunny, cloudy or indoor photography, which selects a shutter speed that will fall somewhere in the middle of the available apertures in those lighting conditions. For example, I'm set at 100 ASA, the sunny position gives me 1/500th of a second, cloudy gives me 1/125th of a second, and indoor gives me 1/30th of a second. I guess this would help someone who wasn't used to changing settings on a camera, but for my part I'll just ignore those markings. On the top of that ring are the actual shutter speed markings, ranging from 1/500th of a second down to 1 second, plus the usual bulb setting. And just firing the shutter reminds you just how quiet and free from vibration these leaf shutter cameras are. Behind the shutter speed ring on the upper left is the X and M lever to change between X for electronic flash and M for the old flash bulbs. The flash sync socket is just below that on the front of the camera. On the lower left is the self-timer lever. Wind this up and press the shutter button before running back to the family group you're attempting to photograph and striking a pose before the shutter fires around 8 or so seconds later. Behind that is the clickless aperture ring with apertures ranging from f1.9 to f16. There's also the auto position, at which point the camera uses its internal meter to set the appropriate aperture. Finally we have the focusing ring with this nice little lever you operate from the underside of the camera. Somewhat unconventionally, the index line for the distance scale is over to one side rather than on the centre line of the lens, but most of the time you'll probably be using the rangefinder to focus and will never look at that. It doesn't have any hyperfocal markings, so you'll need to memorise those if you're planning to use hyperfocal or zone focusing. Moving to the top of the camera, they created quite a clean look with a cold shoe, the frame counter and the shutter release button. As with quite a few cameras of the time that incorporated some form of auto exposure, there's a fair bit of travel before you actually take the shot. This is down to all the linkages required to make the auto system work. It's clever, but also fairly likely to cause issues as the camera gets older. The shutter release also has a useful locking facility for doing long exposures. If you set the shutter speed to bulb and move this ring that surrounds the shutter release button to the T or timed position, now when I press the shutter release, the shutter opens and will remain open until I rotate the ring away from the T position. Obviously you'd need a tripod to keep the camera steady during the long exposure. The button also has the usual threaded section that accepts a standard cable release. There's a bit more to see on the underside of the camera with the rewind crank. A drive release lever which you move to the R position before rewinding the film. A tripod mount with the film door release round the outside. You have to move this safety latch lever before pressing the button that opens the door. And finally the film advancing lever, which has this drop down section at the end, making it pretty easy to locate when you've got the camera up to your eye. On the back of the camera is the viewfinder, which is really nice to use and quite sophisticated compared to some of my other rangefinders. You have the bright line frame with the focusing spot in the centre. As I focus, you'll see the ghost image in the spot move until it lines up with the main image, at which point the subject should be in focus. The arrows at the bottom are the over and under exposure warnings. If I set a shutter speed that's too fast for the available apertures, the left arrow will remain illuminated as I press the shutter button, and the shutter button will be blocked, stopping me from taking an underexposed shot. If I select a more appropriate shutter speed, the arrow will disappear as I press the shutter release and I'll be able to take the shot. If I now select a slow shutter speed and press the shutter button, this time the right arrow will illuminate, indicating that the shot would be overexposed, and as before the button will be blocked, preventing me from taking an overexposed shot. If you've got the camera set in manual mode, you can over or underexpose your shots as much as you like. Lastly, and this is a really cool feature, if we take a look at the viewfinder on my Petri 7S rangefinder camera, it has these parallax markings inside the normal bright line frame. If you're focusing on something closer than, say, about 5 feet, then you should frame your subject using the dots rather than the main frame. This is due to the fact that the view you're looking at isn't through the lens, but is actually slightly above and to one side. Compare that to the viewfinder on the Canon. Now there are no parallax markings to worry about, because the entire bright line frame moves as you focus the camera closer. It's a pretty neat idea, and involves a fair few additional moving parts. Loading a film is pretty straightforward, although they made it easier when they introduced the QL version of the camera a few years later. Open the back, which resets the frame counter at the same time. Pull out the rewind knob. Grab your roll of film and insert the end into the take-up spool. Pull out a bit of film and hold the perforations on the drive sprocket. You can now rotate the take-up spool towards the drive sprocket to get a bit more film under the clamp. Once that's done, drag the film canister across and drop it in the recess. Push in the rewind knob and give it a little turn or two in the direction of the arrow to remove any slack in the film. Make sure the film is sitting flat between the film guides and is still engaged with the drive sprockets. And close the door. Now, making sure the camera isn't in the auto position, advance the film and fire the shutter a couple of times to clear the exposed film, and then you're ready to take photos. Rewinding the film once you got to the end of the roll is even simpler. Move the drive release lever to the R position, flick out the rewind lever, and rewind the film until you feel less resistance as the film releases from the take-up drum. Open the back, pull out the rewind lever, and remove the film cassette. Okay, it's now time for another quick break, so here are some more of the shots taken on this camera. They're just shots I've taken while I've been out and about. In fact, at the time I'm filming the bulk of this video, they're not even back from the lab yet, so they might be totally rubbish. I've really enjoyed using the Canonet. I have a bit of a soft spot for these old rangefinder cameras anyway, but the Canonet just has that bit more quirkiness with its wind lever on the bottom and so on. The lens is quite nice and fast, and the viewfinder is brilliant. I did on one occasion knock the self-timer lever as I got the camera out of my bag. It's quite light and easy to knock. When I took the shot I thought, what's that buzzing noise, as I peered into the camera. This was the result of that slight distraction. I definitely fancy trying one of the third generation QL cameras to see how much they developed the camera over time. As for the design, it's not going to be to everyone's taste, but the crisp, clean lines and fairly minimalist styling would have been quite a change from the cameras that were around a few years before, and I rather like it. Anyway, that's about it for this video. If you've enjoyed watching, please like the video and maybe even subscribe to the channel, not forgetting to click on the bell icon so you get notifications when future videos are released. That's it for now, so thanks for watching, and I'll see you in a future video.